What if the towering figure of tragedy, the bloody tyrant Macbeth, the central monster of Shakespeare's Scottish play, never really existed at all? What if the character we see, racked with guilt and goaded by prophecy, is a complete and deliberate inversion of the truth? This exploration delves into the vast murky chasm that separates the most famous regicide in literature from the historical man, Mac Bethad, Mac Findlaích, a figure whose real story is not one of supernatural downfall, but of dynastic warfare, political savvy, and ultimately a profound and successful reign that was deliberately and brilliantly distorted for the purposes of political propaganda hundreds of years after his death. The tale we know is a fiction. The truth, however, is buried deep in the fragmented chronicles of 11th century Scotland, and it tells a completely different story. The character that William Shakespeare wrote likely penned around 1606 for his new royal patron, King James I, is an undisputed masterpiece of psychological tragedy. He is a complex, deeply human figure, a brave general who is tragically consumed by a single fatal flaw in ambition. This ambition, ignited by the supernatural prophecies of the three witches on the heath and relentlessly stoked by the manipulative, iron-willed ambition of his wife, propels him down a path of murder, paranoia, and ultimately self-destructs. He becomes a man haunted by the ghosts of his own crimes, a study in the corrosive nature of guilt and the emptiness of power when it is gained through illicit means. It is this profound psychological depth, this portrait of a soul's damnation, that makes the play an immortal work of art. He is, in the end, a monster of our own making, a composite of our deepest fears about power. Shakespeare's Macbeth is a regicide who murders his king, his kinsman, and has guessed a threefold violation of 11th century sacred trust in his own home. While the king sleeps, he is a usurper who seizes the throne not by right or by acclamation, but through treacherous assassination. And he becomes a paranoid king, a tyrant who, to secure his ill-gotten crown, descends into a bloody reign of terror, slaughtering the family of his rival Macduff, and plunging the entire kingdom of Scotland into a dark age of fear. This is the monster we all know, the name that is synonymous with ambition, betrayal, and tyranny. But this portrait, this visceral and compelling character, is almost entirely fiction. It is a brilliant, tight, and psychologically astute political drama, but it is, by any serious measure, terrible and profoundly misleading history. Shakespeare, working from flawed sources and with a very specific political agenda, took the barest bones outline of a real historical figure and inverted him, transforming a successful and competent 11th century king into a 17th century equivalent of a cautionary tale, a lesson on the dangers of regicide and the divine right of kings. To find the real Macbeth, we must strip away the layers of Elizabethan stagecraft and Jacobean propaganda and look into the world he actually inhabited. Forget the ominous, Gothic castles of Shakespeare's imagination, the brooding halls of Dunsinane and Inverness where guilty whispers echo in the torchlight. The real 11th century Scotland was a world far stranger and more violent. It was a brutal, fragmented, and perpetually contested land. It was not a unified nation in the modern sense, but a raw, proto-kingdom, a volatile collection of territories held by powerful regional warlords known as Mormirs, who were effectively provincial kings, constantly vying for supremacy, loyalty, and control over the central High Kingship of Alba, as Scotland was then known. This was not a stable, hereditary kingdom as Shakespeare, an Englishman of the 17th century, would have understood it, where a king's eldest son automatically inherited the throne. The rules of succession were a complex and bloody Gaelic system known as tanistry, which blended hereditary right with elective acclamation. This meant that the kingship did not pass neatly from father to son. It was meant to alternate between different, rival branches of the extended royal family. This system, in practice, was a recipe for perpetual civil war, as it created multiple, simultaneous, and legitimate claimants to the same throne at any given time. Under this system, the crown almost always passed between rival royal houses, typically the descendants of King Kenneth MacAlpine. This meant that a reigning king's most dangerous, immediate, and mortal threat was almost never a foreign invader or a disloyal general. It was, invariably, his own cousin, his nephew, or his brother, who possessed an equally valid, or perhaps even stronger, claim to the throne than he did. The succession was less a peaceful transfer of power and more a constant, deadly struggle for supremacy between competing dynastic lines. In this world, violence was not an aberration, it was the primary tool of politics. To become king, you did not simply wait for your father to die. You often had to actively kill the previous king, who was invariably your rival claimant from the other branch of the family. This was the brutal norm. A king who died peacefully in his bed was the rare exception, not the rule. Most kings died in battle, were assassinated, or were removed by their successors. This act, while shocking to us, was not seen as the dark, treacherous murder Shakespeare portrays. It was the accepted, legitimate, and expected mechanism of regime change. So who was the real man lost beneath this mountain of fiction? Meet Mac Bethad Mac Findlaích, or Macbeth, son of Findlaích. He was born around the year 1005, a date that places him squarely in the world of the Vikings, Siena the Great in England, and the High Middle Ages. He was not some grasping, second-tier nobleman. He was the Mormaer, or Duke, of Moray, a vast, powerful, and semi-independent province in northern Scotland. Moray was a Gaelic heartland, and its rulers often saw themselves as the true heirs to the Scottish throne, separate from and often superior to the southern rulers in Scone. Far from being a mere general with a new title, Mac Bethad had a legitimate, powerful, and deeply compelling claim to the high kingship of Scotland himself. While his father was the Mormaer of Moray, his mother, Donata, was, according to some genealogies, a daughter of King Malcolm II. This placed him directly in the main royal bloodline. In the complex world of Tanistry, his claim to the throne was, in the eyes of many, just as strong, if not stronger, than that of the man who eventually became King, Duncan. His upbringing was a brutal introduction to the realities of 11th century power. His father, Findlaích, the Mormaer of Moray, was murdered around 1020, not by some random enemy, but by his own nephews Macbeth's cousins. Macbeth himself was forced to flee, growing up in the shadow of this dynastic violence. He learned from his earliest childhood that power was never given, that it was never secure, and that it could only be held and secured by unwavering strength, political cunning, and the absolute willingness to eliminate your rivals before they eliminated you. Was the historical Lady Macbeth a manipulative, childless monster who goaded her husband to murder? This is perhaps Shakespeare's greatest and most misogynistic fabrication. The real Lady Macbeth was a formidable royal figure in her own right, and she possessed a far better and more direct claim to the throne than her husband ever did. She was not some peripheral noblewoman. Her name was Gruaching in Boyd. She was a direct descendant of the main royal line, the granddaughter of a high king of Scotland, Kenneth III, in the game of dynastic succession. Her bloodline was arguably the most potent in the entire kingdom. She represented a rival branch of the royal family that had been dispossessed and defeated by the current ruling line, the one that had just placed Duncan on the throne. Her life, like Macbeth's, had been defined by dynastic violence. Her first husband, Gile Coamgine, who was also Macbeth's cousin and the Mormaer of Moray, had been burned to death in his hall with 50 of his followers. This murder was very likely orchestrated by the forces of the new King Malcolm II to clear the way for his own grandson, Duncan, to take the throne. This act left Gruach a widow with a young son, Lulic, and a burning grievance against the new regime, she and Macbeth, both of whom had seen their families decimated by the ruling line, then married. This was not a fairy tale romance or dark tale of shared ambition. It was, in its essence, a brilliant and powerful political alliance, a calculated move in the brutal game of dynastic survival. It was a union born from shared loss and a common strategic imperative, consolidating the grievances of two major dispossessed families. This marriage, strategically, was a masterstroke. It united two of the most powerful, rival claims to the throne, weaving them into a single, undeniable challenge. It merged the ancient, regional power of the Mormaers of Moray with the direct, potent, and legitimate royal bloodline of King Kenneth III. Their combined power and their shared, burning grievance against the new regime made them an immediate, existential threat to the new, inexperienced King Duncan. Forget the wise, virtuous, and silver-haired King Duncan from the play, the gracious and sainted old man murdered in his sleep. This is pure fiction, invented to make Macbeth's crime seem all the more heinous. The real Duncan I was a young man, foolish, impetuous, and by all contemporary accounts, a disastrous king. He was the grandson of Malcolm II, who had broken the rules of Tanistry to force his grandson onto the throne. Duncan I came to the throne in 1034, but he was immediately seen as a weak, ineffective, and deeply flawed ruler. He lacked the political skill of his grandfather and the martial prowess required of a Gaelic king. His reign was short, unpopular, and marked by a singular, catastrophic failure that sealed his fate. He was not the wise patriarch of the play. He was a young failure. In 1039, seeking a quick and glorious military victory to cement his authority, Duncan led a catastrophic, ill-conceived invasion of Northumbria in England, laying siege to the city of Durham. The invasion was an unmitigated disaster. He was repulsed, and his army was routed and absolutely decimated. He managed to straggle back to Scotland a defeated and humiliated man. Having lost the respect of his nobles and the strength of his army, he was now deeply unpopular, exposed as militarily incompetent, and seen as fundamentally unfit to rule. In the brutal calculus of 11th century Scotland, a failed king was a dead king. His catastrophic failure in England was not just an embarrassment, it was a political death warrant. It opened the door for a rival claimant, one who was known to be a strong warrior and who possessed a powerful, legitimate claim to the throne. Mac Bethad Mac Findlaích. Macbeth did not, as Shakespeare famously wrote, murder Duncan in his sleep in a fit of ambitions, which fueled treachery. The real Macbeth did what was expected of a rival claimant to a failed king. He challenged him openly on the battlefield. This was not a back-alley stabbing. It was a public bid for the crown, executed according to the violent rules of the time, in the year 1040. Shortly after Duncan's humiliating return from England, Macbeth challenged him for the throne of Scotland. This was open warfare, a civil war between two rival claimants. Macbeth, as the powerful Mormaer of Moray, raised his northern armies and marched south to meet the forces of the weakened High King. The two armies met at the Battle of Bothgownan, which translates to Smith's Pit, a site near modern-day Elgin. It was here that Macbeth's forces, likely more experienced and better led, defeated Duncan's royal army. Duncan I was not stabbed in his bed. He was a warrior king, however inept, and he was cut down and killed in the heat of the fight, as was the norm. To the people of Scotland at the time, this event would not have been viewed as a shocking murder or a usurpation. It was the legitimate removal of a failed, unpopular, and incompetent king by a strong, powerful, and equally legitimate rival claimant. Macbeth had won the throne according to the established rules of dynastic warfare. He then traveled to Scone, the traditional coronation site, and was acclaimed as the new High King of Scotland. After taking the throne, did Macbeth descend into a paranoid, bloody reign of tyranny? As Shakespeare's play insists, the answer, according to every contemporary chronicle and piece of historical evidence, is an emphatic no. The real Macbeth, King of Scotland, ruled as a good king for 17 long and stable years, from 1040 to 1057. His reign, far from being a time of darkness and terror, is described in the contemporary Irish chronicles as a period of rare stability and prosperity. In an age defined by constant warfare, Macbeth's 17-year rule was a remarkable achievement. He successfully united the warring factions of Scotland, bringing the north his homeland of Moray, and the south the traditional seat of power under a single, effective, and peaceful rule. He was known as a strong lawgiver. One of his most significant acts was to enforce law and order, particularly protecting the property and rights of the church, and promoting a new era of stability that allowed agriculture and trade to flourish. He also encouraged the spread of Christianity, gaining the crucial and powerful support of the church, which saw him as a pious and effective monarch. This entire 17-year period is described in contemporary sources like the Annals of Tigernach and the Dwyn Albanac, the Song of the Scots, as a peaceful and prosperous one. The chronicles note that during his reign, the seasons were fertile. This is the traditional Gaelic description of a legitimate and successful king, one blessed by God. It is the literal, historical, and exact opposite of Shakespeare's paranoid, bloody, and cursed reign, where the earth was feverish and did shake. How stable, really, was Macbeth's rule? The single greatest piece of evidence for his confidence and the security of his kingdom is a journey he took in the middle of his reign. No tyrant, no paranoid usurper haunted by rivals, would ever dare to leave his kingdom undefended for months on end. In the year 1050, at the exact midpoint of his 17-year reign, King Macbeth of Scotland went on a pilgrimage to Rome to see the Pope. This journey, traveling the entire length of Europe and back, would have taken many months, possibly a full year. It was an astonishing act for any medieval monarch. This journey demonstrates an immense and almost total confidence in his control of the kingdom. It proves that his rule was not contested, that his rivals were subdued, and that he had the loyalty of his nobles and the church. He had no fear of a coup in his absence. He was not a usurper looking over his shoulder. He was a legitimate, established, and secure Christian king. Furthermore, the contemporary chronicles that mention this pilgrimage, such as the Chronicle of Marianus Scotus, report that in Rome, King Macbeth scattered money like seed to the poor. He was received by the papacy not as a backwards tyrant from the edge of the world, but as a respected, wealthy, and pious Christian monarch, the legitimate ruler of the Kingdom of Alba, far from being a man cursed by supernatural forces and shunned by God. The historical Macbeth was a significant and devout patron of the church. This was a key part of his successful reign, a way to cement his legitimacy, gain the support of the most powerful institution in his kingdom, and portray himself as a lawful God-fearing king in stark contrast to the failed Duncan. He and his wife, Queen Gruach, were recorded as major benefactors to the church. They were not viewed as stained by blood. They were celebrated as patrons. Specifically, they are recorded as granting lands and privileges to the Culdee monks at St. Andrews, the most important religious center in Scotland. Their names are written in the register of the Priory of St. Andrews as patrons, not tyrants. This active and public support of the church was a masterful political move. It secured his alliance with the most powerful and influential institution in the kingdom. The church, in return, supported his reign, viewing him as a defender of the faith and a force for law and order. This is the very definition of a successful medieval king. He governed not as a paranoid despot, but as a lawful, traditional Gaelic king. He successfully united the North and the South, his ancestral lands of Moray with the southern heartlands of the kingdom. This was a feat few had managed before him, a delicate political balance that he maintained for 17 years. Bringing a level of unity and peace to Scotland that it had not seen in generations. Macbeth's peaceful and prosperous 17-year reign was ultimately shattered, not by an internal Scottish rebellion, not by a popular uprising against a hated tyrant, but by a massive, foreign invasion from the south, funded and led by the English. The seeds of his destruction had been sown 17 years earlier, when Duncan I was killed on the battlefield in 1040. His young son, Malcolm, had fled Scotland. He took refuge not in the Highlands, but in the court of Edward the Confessor in England. There, he spent 17 years being raised as an Anglo-Saxon prince, not a Gaelic one. In 1054, he finally convinced the English, and specifically the powerful Earl Seward of Northumbria, to help him reclaim his father's throne. Earl Seward, one of the most powerful military figures in England, led a massive, battle-hardened Anglo-Saxon army into Scotland to depose Macbeth and install Malcolm as a client king, subservient to English interests. The invasion force met Macbeth's Scottish army at the Battle of Dunsinane in 1054. This was a brutal, bloody, and enormous battle, one of the largest and most significant fought in Scotland during that century. A true clash of kingdoms. Contemporary annals, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish Annals, record the sheer scale of the slaughter, noting that thousands of Scots on Macbeth's side and over 1,500 English and Scandinavian warriors on Seward's side were killed. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the invaders. In the end, Macbeth's forces were ultimately defeated on the field. The loss forced him to make a strategic withdrawal, abandoning the southern lowlands, which now fell under Malcolm's control. He was forced to retreat north, back to his traditional, loyalist homeland and power base in Moray. But crucially, and in direct contradiction to the Shakespearean legend, he was not killed. The war was far from over. The man who would become Malcolm III, or Malcolm Kenmore Greathead, was now on Scottish soil, backed by a victorious English army. This was not the return of a beloved, rightful heir. It was the invasion of a foreign-backed claimant. He was a man who had been raised in the English court and was, for all intents and purposes, a foreigner himself. Unlike his father, the inept Duncan, Malcolm was a ruthless, hardened, and effective warrior. He had spent his entire adult life in exile, singularly focused on reclaiming his throne. He had learned the harsh realities of power and was now back to claim what he believed was his birthright, using any means necessary. After the English army installed him in the south, Earl Seward returned to Northumbria, leaving Malcolm to fight his own battles. This was not an immediate, clean victory for Malcolm. He had a foothold, but he did not have the kingdom. After the Battle of Dunsinane, the kingdom was effectively split in two. Malcolm, with his English backing, controlled southern Scotland, the area around Lothian and Strathclyde. But Macbeth, the legitimate crown king, still ruled the north, his traditional Gaelic homeland of Moray, where his support was strongest and where Malcolm was seen as a foreign puppet. For 3 more long years, from 1054 to 1057, Scotland was plunged into a bloody, grinding civil war. This was not a quick resolution, but a protracted struggle. Malcolm, from his base in the south, launched multiple campaigns, pushing north into Macbeth's territory, trying to dislodge him from his stronghold. Macbeth did not die at Dunsinane, nor was he killed by a man of no woman born. As Shakespeare's prophecy famously required, his actual, historical end came 3 long and bloody years later, as he continued to fight for his crown against the invading forces of Malcolm, defending his kingdom and his title to the very last. In August 1057, Malcolm, pushing ever further north, finally cornered Macbeth and his remaining loyal forces at Lumphanan in Aberdeenshire. Here, the final battle of the war was fought, a last stand for the King of Moray against the Anglo-Saxon-backed invader. Macbeth, now 52 years old, and having ruled for 17 years, was defeated. He was killed in the battle. According to some later chronicles, he was killed in single combat by Malcolm himself, a fitting, if brutal, end for a warrior king. He died as he had lived, a warrior fighting for his crown. He was not a guilt-ridden coward, not a paranoid tyrant killed by a loophole in a prophecy, but a 52-year-old Gaelic king, the last of his line, who was defeated in open battle by a ruthless, foreign-backed invader. He was buried, not in some unconsecrated grave, but on the sacred Isle of Iona, the traditional resting place of all legitimate high kings of Scotland. So how did this competent, successful, and pious 17-year king become the archetypal bloody monster of literature? The story of this character assassination begins almost 500 years after his death. In the court of the Tudor and Stuart dynasties, who had their own political agenda, in the 1570s and 1580s, Raphael Holincht published his massive, sprawling Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This was a compendium of history, folklore, and myth, and it served as the primary historical sourcebook for Shakespeare and other playwrights of his era. This was the text that Shakespeare almost certainly read, but Holinshed's own sources for this 11th century history were themselves deeply biased. They were written centuries after Macbeth's death by historians like Hector Bose, who were writing to flatter the current ruling dynasty, the Stuarts, to legitimize the Stuart line. These later chroniclers repeated and likely embellished fantastic stories, deliberately turning Macbeth into a dark, illegitimate usurper. They introduced the supernatural elements, the witches, and the prophecies, all to portray Macbeth as a diabolical figure who had stolen the crown from the rightful king, Duncan, and his rightful heir, Malcolm, from whom the Stuarts claimed descent. Why did Shakespeare seize on this particular, distorted story? Because in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died childless, and the throne of England passed to his new boss, his new patron, King James I of England, who was also, and had always been, King James VI of Scotland. King James was a Stuart. He was famously and morbidly obsessed with witchcraft, even writing a book on the subject called Daemonology. And most importantly, King James I firmly believed that he was a direct, lineal descendant of the fictional noble Banquo. This was a key part of the Stuart family's foundational myth. Shakespeare's play, therefore, is a brilliant and dazzling piece of political propaganda, tailor-made to flatter his new king. It is a cautionary tale about the evils of regicide, a sensitive topic for James, whose own father was murdered, and the chaos that ensues when the divinely appointed royal line is broken. By writing Macbeth, Shakespeare achieved several goals at once. He demonized Macbeth, the usurper of the rightful king. He glorified the mythical Banquo, thou shalt get kings, though thou be none, the supposed ancestor of his new patron, King James, and he pandered to his king's known obsession with witchcraft. It was a political masterstroke, but a historical travesty. Shakespeare, in his genius, created an immortal character, a timeless tragedy of ambition and guilt that will be studied and performed forever, but in doing so, he utterly destroyed the reputation of a real man. History and the real Macbeth deserve to remember the truth. Mac Bethad Mac Findlaích was a complex, effective, and, by the standards of his time, a pious 11th century Gaelic king. He ruled a stable, peaceful, and united Scotland for 17 years. He was not a tyrant. He was a legitimate ruler, a patron of the church, and a respected monarch who died a warrior's death, defending his crown against a foreign-backed invasion. His true story is not one of supernatural evil, which is prophecies, or a wife's manipulation. It is a far more familiar and tragic story, one of dynastic struggle, political ambition, a successful reign, and ultimately, a devastatingly effective act of historical libel, immortalized by the greatest writer in the English language.